This video includes an ad for Squarespace. We finished rebuilding this entire bathroom almost 2 years ago now. And shortly after, we moved into this place, which was at the time still a construction site. So to just have something, we put some temporary furniture in here, thinking that we were gonna replace it within a couple of months. That's coming up on 2 years, and everything still looks exactly the same. We still got this way too large temporary sink that we got given for free, and it's still sitting on some leftover bits of ladder that we chopped up from one of the beds that's in here when we bought the place. So we're not only gonna replace this entire unit, we're gonna make a new one entirely from scratch. In addition to that, a bunch of other furniture. The spacing here is just not very well utilized. So let's get rid of everything in here and then start building. First off, let's start with the fun bit. Because most of the work that I'll have to put into this project is just gonna be me building various sized cabinets. And after building cabinets in various shapes and sizes for the better part of a year now, that's not what I'm most excited about. What I am excited about, however, is this stuff. These are all my offcuts of the material that I used to build the kitchen countertop. And for those of you who have seen that video, know that this is a type of hard plasticky material. It's quite similar to acrylic. This particular one is called Hymax, but it's essentially the same as Corian. And the reason why this stuff is so cool is that there's a specific glue in the exact same color as this material. And if you use it right, the seam is completely invisible. And now, I did lie a little bit because I have already started on the cabinet making. This is the unit that the sink will go into. It will have 4 drawers in here. Those will come later. I thought it'd be a good idea to have this unit ready before I make the sink, just to make sure all the parts fit before you glue them together. And I've also made this cardboard mock-up just to see if I've got everything right. I think it looks okay. And here you can also see that my plan is to make a sink that doesn't have a central drain, but rather one continuous tiny little slot in the back. I think they're called infinity sinks. Now there is one common issue with this style sink, and that is how do you clean it and what happens if it gets clogged. Now I do think I've got a pretty good solution for that, which of course is gonna involve some 3D printing, and I'm really excited to show you how that's gonna work. It looks like I'll have just enough to create this sink. Now another nice thing about this material is that you can use regular wood cutting blades to cut this out. So I'll start with a combination of my track saw and my big table saw, cut out all the pieces, and then we'll start gluing and puzzle piecing it together into a sink. So these are the parts that will make up this sink. And as you can see, they're all taped up, and a lot of things have actually already happened to them. For starters, I've already pre-assembled 2 of these parts. They're currently all taped up and ready for glue up, but you can see that this assembly now has a kink into it. This was actually 2 individual parts, glued together and sanded the transition nice and smooth. And this thing, as you can see, is also put together of a whole bunch of different parts. This will make up the back section, and this obviously will then be the slope for the drain. There'll be a little slot in the back there where the water runs out. So the next step is gluing all this together, which is definitely gonna be the most nerve-wracking part, because I have to do it all in one go. And that's also why all of this is taped up. It'll be really difficult to remove the glue and sand this once everything is assembled. So I've already pre-sanded and finished all of these surfaces to make my life as easy as possible later on. Now the way all this is gonna go together, and I'm quite happy with this actually, I've glued on some locating pins. They're actually set at an angle, so now all of this just neatly locates against each other, and the back section will actually bolt on in from the side, mostly just to locate it and hold it in place. Not because it really needs the screws, but it was just the best way I could think of to both locate it and hold it together as the glue dries. Talking about the glue, this is a 2-part glue with hardener and glue in 2 different chambers that get pushed out simultaneously through this really cool gun. And then as the glue gets pushed out, it gets pre-mixed in this mixing tube. So all I have to do is squirt it all over the place, clamp it all tight, and hope that I did it right. Oh, and also this is probably the worst and most chemical smell I've ever smelled. So I'll be wearing one of these. Now, I don't have a great plan. I'm just gonna try and get this glue everywhere and then clamp it together, because this stuff sets really fast.
Ah! Oh, good thing I taped it. Oh God. That was stressful.
Now, surprisingly enough, that worked out pretty well. After making that huge mess, I let everything dry just a little bit until it gets to that sweet spot where it's still a little bit soft, but not sticky enough to just stick to everything. I then removed all the masking tape, and for that little bit of residue, I used a toothpick to scrape that away, which worked really, really well. And by the way, that sweet spot where the glue is just soft enough to be a little bit bendy, but not sticky anymore, it's also the perfect time to scrape it off your work table that you forgot to cover up before you start all this. Now, the locator pins that were attached to the bottom of this, I knocked back off. Now, I didn't quite wait long enough to do that, so I knocked 2 of these pieces back apart. Had to reglue those. Everything's had plenty of time to dry. We're gonna glue it onto, well, the top bit, which is gonna turn it into something a lot more recognizable as a zinc. I've chosen to assemble this a little bit strangely, where 3 of the sides are glued on from the bottom, which is nice and easy. I can just leave a bit of a gap all the way around and then trim it off with a trim router once everything is glued. But for the front, I'm gonna glue the seam together end to end to get that nice transition over the edge here. Now that meant that this opening in the front here needed to be really precise. So I cut it a little bit oversized and then filed it down till it fit perfectly. Now this part, I did mess up just a little bit. I filed a bit too much in and removed a bit too much material. Now to fix that, don't really know. Right now, I'm leaning towards just adding a bunch of glue and then hoping that once everything is cut to size and sanded, that it will look all right. Talking about glue, that's the next step. Okay, that did take a lot of time. All in all, I think I've been sanding this thing for the better part of 2 full days. I made a complete rust around me. I've used every single sander that I own. All of these are fantastic, by the way. But what we're left with is an end result that I am so happy with. I could not have wished for it turning out any better. All the places where I was worried, inside the corners here where I cut away a little bit too much, or the transitions in the back here, all turned out great. Luckily, the glue is such a good match that even the areas where I've had to fill up quite a bit blend in quite nicely. Probably the most tricky bit was trying to get the transition between the round edge of the router and the straight glued together piece in the back here to be nice and smooth. I don't think I've ever used this many different types of sandpaper and files, and so what we're left with now is essentially the top half, which is completely done, and a bottom which looks like this. This is where the water will run out. You'll notice that I've made that section quite a bit larger. I've also glued on 2 additional pieces on the sides. All in that in preparation for the next part, which I sort of hinted at the beginning, or actually it's currently 3 parts. So this is gonna be my way of solving the issue of how do you get a slot like this to drain properly, not take up too much space, and be easily cleanable. So this 3D printed part will attach together with the 2 side pieces, creating a big track which is sloped, and this whole thing will bolt onto there. So that I can now use this regular old-fashioned style drain, plop that in there, screw it all together, and the rest of the drainage system attaches to here. But first, we need to make these 3 pieces one and make them watertight. Now the first part of this will be pretty easy. There's bolt holes on either side. I've got a space for a square captain nut on one of the parts and a countersunk hole on the other one. Nice and easy, just screw this together. And now that 3 parts are one, we are ready to tackle the next problem, which is trying to make this thing watertight. Now for that, I've got some marine grade epoxy, and my plan is just mix a little bit of this up and then brush on the entire inside of this thing to make it really watertight. I mean, it's not gonna have to withstand any pressure or anything like that, so I think we'll be fine. And after letting it dry and repeating that same process a second time, we've got a nice and thick coating of epoxy on the entire inside surface here, which I hope should be plenty to make this thing watertight enough. Now all that's left is attaching it to the sink, and to do that I'm going to use these tiny little brass inserts so I can bolt straight into this. I've actually already put in 2 of these to make sure that everything actually lines up, and then I'll use a center punch which will fit exactly inside the hole, which allows me to mark the exact center of each one of these holes. So that I can now use those center marks to drill some holes with some 6.4 millimeter drill bits. And like an absolute idiot, just drill straight through on the first try. Oh, all right, it's not a big hole, but it's annoying. I did a whole bunch of tests. It must have shifted gradually over time. I'm gonna have to fill that with a bit of glue later and sand it flush. I know what the problem is. Because of the transition here, I sanded so much that the material thickness is actually smaller, and that's why I drilled the hole through. That's annoying. Okay, let's try another one. All right, did find out a little trick. Light from the back here, and then drill until you can see the light shine through. But stop before there's a hole. And luckily now for the rest of them, the back isn't gonna be visible, so I'm just gonna drill to the right depth immediately. And now because of some of these not so deep holes, I've had to shorten some of these inserts, but they still go in the same way as the other ones. And that is just with a hammer. First one. Feel like I could have made this process easier for myself. Not only did I create that little hole that I had to fill in, after successfully not drilling through the rest of the holes, test fitted this thing in place, screwed in all the screws, flipped the thing over. Turns out all the screws in the front here, because the material now is thinner than it was supposed to be, the screws are too long, the screws pushed through the material and pushed a chunk out of each hole. So I had to glue everything back in place, let the glue dry, chisel that away, sand it nice and flush, which is a huge pain on the inside here. But we're finally back to what it looked like before I started drilling holes. But now this time, I've got all the inserts in place and I've ground down and shortened all the screws so that that won't happen again. Now onto the last piece of the puzzle, and that is making a good seal between this part and this flat surface. And for that, I've got a really long piece of O-ring material, and in this piece, there's a groove into which this O-ring material should fit really nicely. To get this fit just right, I test printed a couple of pieces with varying shapes for the tracks and depth and width until I land on something which I think is going to be a really nice fit. Only thing left is to turn this piece of string into one loop, and for that I've got this special super glue, which a little drop on this test piece here, stick the two ends together, and after just a few seconds, I almost didn't believe this at first, it's not coming apart. I mean, is this crazy? At first, I thought this was just super glue and considered just using super glue because this stuff is fairly expensive for what it is. But I cannot pull this apart. So I did the same thing, only larger, so that we can now nicely fit this into the groove here. And now hopefully this should create a nice seal when we bolt it back in place. Only one thing left to do. The only way I know how to test whether or not this thing is gonna be watertight. I've taped over this lot with some duct tape, hopefully making it pretty tight so that I can now blow into it and hope that the fact that I can't really detect any obvious leaks is gonna be good enough for the unpressurized water that's gonna be just flowing through here. Now, lucky me, I get to take all this back apart, remove the tape, and then reassemble it with the now shortened version of the drain connector, and then it's finally time to install this at home. But first, a quick ad for today's sponsor, Squarespace. So when I'm not renovating my bathroom, I usually make and design stuff here in my workshop. And I sell the build plans and 3D files for those on my website. A website which I created using Squarespace. You can now start building your own completely personalized website with their guided design system, Squarespace Blueprint. Choose from professionally curated layout and styling options to build an online presence from the ground up. Tailored to your brand or business and optimized for every device. So Squarespace is a huge part of the reason why I'm able to do what I do. I actually use Squarespace to build my own website way before they started sponsoring my videos. I sell build plans and 3D files on my website, but whether you want to sell digital or physical products, Squarespace has the tools you need to start selling online. Squarespace is the all-in-one platform for building your brand and growing your business online. Head to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, head to squarespace.com/ALCH for 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. And now finally, back at home, I've glued the sink onto the wooden frame. And not only that, this thing is now joined by the rest of the cabinetry that will go inside of this bathroom. So there's not one, but 2, 3, 4, 5 individual cabinets that are all gonna fill out this tiny bathroom. Now I'm sure you're wondering how all this is gonna fit in such a tight space, but before we get to installing, I just noticed something. This cabinet right here is meant to go on top of the washing machine. And as you can see, it's just about my height. Problem is, top of washing machine does not have enough space to fit a person my height. And definitely not, since I also want to include some space above for both the speaker and all the electronics for the lights and everything else in here. Now that means I get to not only disassemble this whole thing again, chuck it back in my car, drive it to the workshop, and then try cut it down to size. I also get to try and figure out how I'm gonna make it work with the 2 doors that now need cutting down both at the top and the bottom. I need to edge bend those again, oil them again, figure out new locations for both the hinges and the mounting points. Then I get to reassemble the whole thing, carry it all back up the stairs before we then finally are able to start installing everything. And as you can see, I've already installed the first cabinet. This thing is relatively simple. It just went on top of the little box that we have here. Essentially, all that's missing here is the little filler strip on the side here, which conveniently I've already cut to size. Now in this strip, there's a little groove for, of course, some LED lights. You might notice that there's a lot more light in here now. That is because I've temporarily hooked up those 2 LED strips just to give us a bit more light when we work. Now, in addition to those lights, you can also see that I've been drilling a bunch of holes, which I hope are in the right place. Essentially, I just spent a bunch of time figuring out where everything was supposed to be, and then it's just a matter of crossing my fingers and hope that I don't hit a water line. I hit a stud. At least it's not a water line. So now all that should be totally ready for electrician. Only problem is that he gets here in 3 to 4 hours. And by the time he gets here, I need to have installed all the furniture. So it's a race. Wow. We're doing the massive cabinet above the washing machine, which currently is not fitting. Might have been easier to install this inside. We've got some Climax clips to hold these 2 parts together. That's in there. That went surprisingly well. A couple of screws to attach this, and it's on to the other side. And now, finally, the thing I've spent so much time on, it's finally time to install the sink. And it just so happens that one of these green crates is super close to the right height, so now I can just use some shims in between the bottom there, get it nice and level, and screw it onto the wall. All right, that's pretty stuck. And look, it's level. It's finally time for the mirror. The mirror is this black thing currently upside down on this mat. But before we can install it, I'm gonna glue in this heating mat. I'll show you what this is for later. In the meantime, you can have a guess in the comments. This is essentially the exact same stuff as the floor heating in the entire apartment. Only this thing has a piece of double-sided tape on the bottom, which makes it super nice and easy to install. All right, get some glue on the wall and then stick it on. So the mirror people said don't use too much glue, don't know how much too much is, so I'm just gonna go for glue. If I had to guess, I would say that this is probably way too much glue. Oh, Jesus. That changed the whole room. My God, doesn't this look awesome? A big mirror like this totally changes the room instantly. But the electrician's gonna be here in half an hour, so it's time to install the last cabinet. Luckily, it's the smallest one, and it is gonna go right next to the mirror. Hence, the mirror had to go in place first. I'll hold it, build a little line at the bottom, and then I'll screw it on with some pocket hole screws. There's plywood behind all of these walls, which gives us a really nice and secure attachment mechanism. This sure is stressful, but last couple of holes for the outlets, and we're ready for electrician. See you guys when he's been here. We made it just in time. The electrician just left and installed everything. So now we have... It's the wrong button. Some more lights in here, huh? Absolutely everything electrical is totally hooked up. There's now outlets in all of the cabinets, cut the LED strips to size, and pushed them into the groove. And I gotta say, it's finally starting to look like a bathroom. And of course, one of the things that are still missing in this cabinet are some drawers. And these are made the exact same way as I've always made drawers, using Bloom hardware. And Bloom kindly provided all the hardware for this entire project, including these really nice drawer slides. We've got 2 separate drawers for each side. I think that's a lot more convenient. And we've of course got 2 bottom ones as well. Just like that, everything clicks in place. And for handles, I just routed a groove in the backside of the fronts and then inset this front brace so that when you close it, it's nice and tight, but you still have some place for your fingers to grab onto. Oh, and also, the plumber's been here and hooked up the water, and the faucet works, the drain works. It seems to be holding water just fine. This thing was sure a lot of work, but I'm really happy I did it. And the fit for the drain pipe when I open and close this drawer, pretty tight. And now, in some way to make up for the fact that the large cabinet didn't fit, check out this thing. This little cabinet will hold some towels, and since the edge of this pocket that it fits inside of isn't perfectly straight because of all the waterproofing and micro cement that we had to do, I made this thing with a lip all the way around the edge, so that from the front it looks like one single sheet of 90mm plywood, but it is actually made up of 2 90mm sheets. Now this whole thing will just get glued in place with plenty of glue. Well, I hope that I'm not the one that ever has to remove that thing. And finally, also to some of the more tedious parts of this project, that being trim and caulking. In order to make sure that the bottom part of this wood here doesn't get damaged if there's a leak from this, I caulked the inside all the way around, which meant I had to pull the entire machine out. Now, luckily there was plenty of space and there was no problem getting in there at all. Now, while I was in there, I also installed this neat 3D printed grill up top here to act as an air vent, but block objects from going inside there. This whole thing is just printed on my 3D printer in 3 parts, glued together and screwed in from the back, which then finally allowed me to slide this big washing machine back in place. And since I had the washing machine out, it was quite convenient to start on the trim. Now, since there's only 3 pieces of trim for this entire project, I could not be bothered carrying my big miter saw all the way up here. So I used just one of these really cheap plastic guides, including a saw for like 20 bucks, and it worked surprisingly well. Then after everything was cut to size, I was lucky enough that Vilda very kindly painted all the trim and did a fantastic job at that, because now it's so much easier to install these. This is the last one we're missing. A dab of CA glue on the miters, shoot it in place, and all I need to do is fill and sand those tiny holes, give it just a little bit of touch-up of paint, and that's all the trim we have to do for this project. I've also gone ahead and done some of the annoying caulking stuff with silicone around all the places where water might get to, and I've installed a shelf in the middle here, for which we ran a tube all the way back when we did all the waterproofing in here, so that we can now have an LED strip in this little shelf. This whole shelf is actually just glued in place with construction adhesive and then caulked all the way around to make the transition nice and smooth. And to finish off this section nicely, I glued on a piece of corian, which I actually had to shave down the entire thickness of. I made it a little bit thinner than it needed to be, and then just used plenty of glue so I was able to push it in place and line it up perfectly flush to this one and square to everything else. I even glued on a tiny little film strip next to a mirror. Now that means that we're finally at the point where we can start installing doors into things. Now, as opposed to most of the other structure of this build, which is plywood, these doors are going to be MDF. Reason for that being, MDF is a whole lot more stable, especially in moist environments, and a big flat door like this would just twist and bend like crazy if it was made out of plywood. Because MDF doesn't look that nice, we've covered up the edges with some edge banding, so that once everything is trimmed up, sanded nice and smooth, the whole thing looks like one solid piece of oak, which is fantastic. Only problem is that I want the handles for this thing to be just a hole that you stick your finger in and pull out, but that of course would expose the MDF core. Now, to solve that problem, I've made these things, which are oak rings that I made on my Avid CNC machine. So I'm gonna try and glue these to the inside of this hole. Listen to this fit. So I'm hoping that with a bit of glue and a bit of convincing, they should slide right in. That went way better than expected. Well, I mean, don't jinx it. You know what? That did turn out quite all right. Now the last step is a little round over and some sanding with some tiny strips of torn off sandpaper. And I think that turned out so nice. A perfect little oak donut as a handle. So you see, that's why it was such a pain to try and cut these things to size, because I'd already finished the entire door with the handle and couldn't just cut off the top and bottom of them. Regardless, they snap in place, and with this second door added, this first cabinet is finally finished. After it's cut to size and test assembled, we disassemble everything again, sand everything up to 180 grit, then Vilda first oiled all the parts with one initial layer of white pigmented oil, and since it's gonna be pretty moist in here, we added a second layer of protective clear oil that was rolled on a little bit thicker, which leaves this really nice and light wood with a matte surface finish that will also give plenty of protection. Oh, by the way, I've added this little filler strip in the back here to make the transition between these two surfaces nice and smooth. On the other side here, same thing again, added another door, which leaves us with the last cabinet, which is this little skinny one. So this is the standard thickness that I usually use for doors. It's 19 millimeters. And adding something like this to the inside of this really shallow cabinet would just take up too much space. And adding it to the outside would just feel really clunky. So instead, we're gonna do something really cool and use this 9mm piece of Velcro mat. Velcro mat is a type of through colored MDF, which I've also used for my worktop in my workshop. Now, normally that would come with its own set of challenges. Because this front is so thin, the conventional hardware that I normally use for fronts and I've used for all the other fronts mounts into holes that would have to be deeper than the material thickness. So obviously that's not gonna work. Now luckily, Bloom makes really cool hinges like these. These are called Expando T, and these are specifically made to go into thin fronts all the way down to 8mm. The way they work is by first drilling some holes, and I'm gonna use my Bloom guide to mark the locations for these, and then using a 10mm drill bit with a stop lock attached, we can carefully drill those two holes. And now with these really cool expanding mechanisms, which go into those holes, and once they're tightened, they tighten themselves to the piece of wood and lock themselves in place. Click those in place just like normal hinges, and we've got the final piece of the puzzle, the last front. And I've left a bit of overhang at the bottom, so this is how I'll be able to open it. And of course, these hinges also have soft close. And the black doors also match all the other black details, like for instance, the set of towel holders that were installed here, which are actually just regular wardrobe holders, the same I used in the wardrobe for a hallway, which matches great with this little holder for hand towels on the side. And to finish it all off, I've installed all the trim pieces that go on the top of each one of the cabinets that seal off up towards the ceiling. And of course, I couldn't help myself. At the top of this cabinet, I routed out a grid pattern so that I could fit a speaker behind there. And the more observant of you that have watched my other videos might have noticed that this pattern, although quite similar, is slightly different from the one we did in the kitchen and in the bedroom. The kitchen has a herringbone pattern to match with the herringbone floor. The bedroom has an offset pattern to match with the floor there. And this one has a wavy pattern to follow the theme of the bathroom. And you might recognize this wavy pattern from the 3D printed part up top here. And there's actually one more piece, which is all the way on the top there. That cover is removable, and behind there, there's a thing called a hydrostat, which turns on power once the humidity gets high enough. So you remember that thing that I stuck behind the mirror? Well, let's increase the humidity here a bit. Oh and yeah, I've also installed glass shower doors since the last time you saw this bathroom. Kind of nerve-wracking to drill holes into the tiles that we spent so much time installing, but I think it looks great. Okay, so as the water has been running quite a while now and it's getting pretty steamy in here, the mat that I stuck to the back side of the mirror is now heating up, which means that instead of a foggy mirror like this, you got a crystal clear mirror as soon as you step out of the shower. And with that, as it's getting really hot and sweaty in here, we are finally finished with this bathroom. It has been such a long project. It's taken so much longer than I initially anticipated. So I hope you enjoyed watching. This is officially the last full build video of the renovation series. Let me know in the comments below if you'd like to see a house tour showing you all that we've done in the last 2.5 years. As for now, thanks for watching. See you guys next time.